Hey guys, we're now just 3 weeks away from the midterms on the 8th of November, as you can see here on our countdown, just 21 days away from the Senate elections. We have 35 races across the country, so today I'll be updating my 2022 Senate map based on my latest projections in every single one of these races. And so we're just going to get right into it, starting off with all of the solid races for either party, and then we're going to move on to the closer races in order of increasing competitiveness. I think it's the best way for us to do this. So with all of the solid states filled in for Democrats, they have 43 seats, and for Republicans, they will have the exact same number of seats. And so basically, these are the races that are not going to be competitive at all. These states are going to vote for either one party, and there's really not too much to talk about in these elections. So 43-43 with 14 toss-up elections remaining after the solid states have all been filled in. And so now moving on to the races left in gray, we're going to start off with the least competitive of all of these elections, and that is going to be the one in Connecticut, where Richard Blumenthal is running for re-election to a second term. He is easily going to defeat Leroy Levy, and I do think he will do better than 11.7%. I think he can win by 12 or 13, but I think that there's a very good chance that he will not win by over 15, which would make Connecticut technically a likely Democratic state, and so that's going to be the first non-solid state on our map. Next up, we have a race in Utah where Mike Lee is really struggling against independent Evan McMillan. Mike Lee is currently up by 7.8% in the polls, and when looking at the latest data, I mean, these numbers really just aren't that good for the incumbent Republican who won by 41% back in 2016. However, as the GOP candidate, Mike Lee is going to win in the very solid red state of Utah, even though McMillan is putting up a pretty strong fight, considering that we never see any close races in the Beehive state, but Utah is going to go red, and it will have a likely rating. In Washington, we have an interesting race between Patty Murray and Tiffany Smiley. This was one of the potential pickups for the GOP a couple of months back, because many Republicans were hoping that Tiffany Smiley could catch up to Patty Murray's polling lead. However, she's now up by 9.8%. She already won a majority in the blanket primary, so it really does seem very, very unlikely that Murray is going to lose her fifth term. She's running as a four-time incumbent, and four-time incumbents almost never lose their re-election. So Washington is going to be a state that will continue to vote for Democrats, but it will only do so by a likely margin. We have another longtime member of the Senate in Iowa who's also running for re-election, but his race is going to be even closer this year. Chuck Grassley is running against Michael Franken. Grassley is a 7-time incumbent, now running for his 8th term, and if he does win re-election, he will be the longest-serving member of Congress after Patrick Leahy retires in early 2023. So Michael Franken is the Democratic challenger in this race, and this will probably be the only election in Iowa's last 40 years that Chuck Grassley will not win by a solid margin. The only close race he's ever been in before this one was his election all the way back in 1980 when he was first elected to the upper chamber. But since then, Chuck Grassley has won all of his elections very easily by very solid margins, no matter what the year is. But this year, even though it's a good year for the GOP, Chuck Grassley is going to struggle a little bit more. His age has a major impact on his performance, and I think that Michael Franken is taking advantage of that. That's why Grassley only leads by 7.4% in the polls, but Iowa is still going to be a red state, just not as solid as it was before, as Chuck Grassley is currently on track to winning re-election. Next up, in Florida, Marco Rubio is running for his 3rd term with Val Demings as the Democratic challenger. She currently is a member of the House, and I think that in the end, she is going to lose, and Hurricane Ian will not help her chances at all. The hurricane, I think, is going to boost both Marco Rubio and Ron DeSantis in the governor election against Charlie Crist, and so with Rubio up by 4.6% currently, I think that's very reasonable to say that he will win by over 5 in November. He won by 8 points back in 2016. Rubio is a popular incumbent, and it will be very, very difficult for him to be unseated anywhere in the near future, and Rubio plus 4.6, I think that will translate to an eventual result of Rubio plus 7 or 8, just like his margin from 2016. So right now, Republicans are going to hold on to their seat in Georgia, as Democrats simply are not doing that great of a job turning the state back, as Florida continues to shift to the right. We have another 2-time incumbent running for re-election in Colorado as well. Michael Bennet is up by 8 points in the polls against Joe Dea. Bennet was first appointed to the Senate in 2009 and has won re-election in both 2016 as well as back in 2010. But now in 2022, Bennet is on track to win a 3rd time. He's led in every single poll for this race, even if it's funded by the most Republican pollsters. Joe Dea is a moderate Republican, really not that bad of a choice by the GOP, but right now Michael Bennet is clearly on track to winning re-election election. And so Colorado is going to be our third likely Democratic state. And so with just 8 races remaining, the Senate currently sits at 46-46, and this just goes to show you just how competitive this year's elections are going to be. And so at this point, we're left with the actual competitive races. The races that we've just gone over, these races are not going to be solid for either party, but they're really not going to have too large of an impact on the eventual results. It's going to be these 8 races that matter the most. And so the first one out of these 8 is going to be New Hampshire, which is actually going to be a likely Democratic state, just not by as strong of a margin as the other races that we've gone over. I think that Maggie Hassan can win by just over 5 points, as Don Bolduc really is a pretty weak nominee by the GOP. He is just way too far to the right for a state that voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election by 7.4%. In fact, Don Bolduc on a debate stage actually said that Donald Trump won the presidential election 2 years ago, and that is not going to bode well for him in a state that voted for Jeanne Shaheen by a solid margin back in 2020 as well, 15.6%. Democrats really did do well in the state in the last election. I think they're going to do okay with Maggie Hassan winning her re-election. She barely won in 2016, but this was a flip for the Democratic Party, which was a pretty big deal. That's what gave Democrats their 48th seat, but right now Democrats are on track to winning New Hampshire once again with Maggie Hassan as the incumbent, and so right now I am projecting a 5 to 6% margin, which will make the state just barely a likely one for Democrats, and 538 currently gives Maggie Hassan an 84% chance at winning a second full term. And now moving on to Wisconsin, this is not to balance out the map. This really is just how competitive the races are going to be in order of how close they are. So Wisconsin will be next with Ron Johnson running for re-election against Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes. Even though Joe Biden won the state back in 2020, it's unlikely that Mandela Barnes is going to flip this state in 2022. Ron Johnson won a surprise victory back in 2016 to a second term by 3.4% against Russ Feingold, who served 2 terms in the Senate before he was defeated by Johnson back in 2010. And so Ron Johnson at that point in time 6 years ago was behind in basically every single poll released for the race, but this year he is actually ahead. He's ahead by 2.9%, and I do think that he is on track to winning re-election for a third time, even though he promised that he would not run again after winning in 2016 with pressure from Donald Trump and many others in the establishment of the GOP. He was pressured into running, and that is a big reason why Republicans have a good chance at winning, because I think that if they chose a new candidate, they would struggle in the state. Mandela Barnes is not a weak candidate, but as a very establishment figure in Republican politics in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson is not a weak candidate, and he is currently up by 3 points. And of course, polls almost always underestimate GOP support in the state. So right now, I do have Wisconsin as a state that's going to go to the GOP and by a likely margin, just like New Hampshire. I think it'll be just over 5 points, so it's not going to be a strong margin by any means, but I do think that Ron Johnson will do relatively well and win a third term in office. 538 currently gives him a 72% chance at defeating Barnes. Still a pretty high chance, but it's definitely less than it was before Barnes won the Democratic nomination. In fact, at one point, he had a 77% chance at winning this race when this forecast was first released, and then his odds went down to just 51 when the polls showed a very close election between the two candidates, as Mandela Barnes was ahead in the polls for quite a while after the primary election in the state, but now Ron Johnson is doing much better, and he has a very good chance at winning his re-election this year. And so that will be all of the likely and solid states for either party. Now the only races remaining are going to be either lean or tilt, with 6 elections left. And so the first one I have is North Carolina, which I do think will be more solid for the GOP than the election in Ohio, and then of course for Democrats in Pennsylvania and Arizona. So out of all of the lean states, I think North Carolina is going to be the least competitive, where Ted Budd is running against Sherry Beasley after Richard Burr, the incumbent Republican, announced that he would not be running for a third time. So Ted Budd is currently up by 2.1% in the polls, a pretty large lead considering the polls in North Carolina, just like they do in Wisconsin, typically underestimate Republicans, and I think that that has been a cause for Democrats trying in the state so hard over the last decade and still losing. Just look back at 2020, Cal Cunningham lost Senate race to Tom Tillis despite leading in every single poll. It was a close election, but still, Tom Tillis winning was a big surprise, and Joe Biden also lost North Carolina to Trump, even though he won Georgia. North Carolina is just not that blue of a state yet. The last time Democrats won a Senate election or presidential election in the state was back in 2008 with the elections of Kay Hagan and Barack Obama, respectively. But in 2022, North Carolina simply is not in a position to flip. I think in the next decade it will go blue, but it's not going to be now. And so North Carolina will remain a red state, and Ted Budd will become the new senator from the Tar Heel state. I think he'll win by around 4 to 5%, so just right under the likely threshold, but still a win for the GOP as they will hold on to the seat. And next up in Ohio, J.D. Vance is running against Tim Ryan for the Senate seat in Ohio to succeed Rob Portman, and this election is much closer than it should be. In fact, it comes after North Carolina in terms of how competitive it's going to be. J.D. Vance is currently up in the polls by 0.2%, however, he's been behind basically 95% of the time over the last 3 months when this race really began. Tim Ryan is running a very strong campaign as a 10-time congressman currently representing the 13th district of Ohio, but J.D. Vance up by 0.2. That's an abysmal margin. However, the good news for the GOP is just like in North Carolina, just like in Wisconsin, polls in the state do tend to underestimate Republicans, and even though Sherrod Brown won in 2018, Democrats will have trouble flipping this state. It, of course, will be a flip, and voters really just aren't as enthusiastic about Democrats as they were 4 years ago. I think that if this race between Vance and Ryan were held in 2018, definitely J.D. Vance would be the favored candidate. However, we're simply just not living in that sort of environment at this point in time right now. J.D. Vance is preferred. The fact that he is a Republican will be enough to carry him over the finish line. And of course, we also have a governor election that is not competitive at all. Mike DeWine is expected to win by a very solid margin against Nan Whaley, even though his party is struggling in the Senate race. And just looking at the 538 forecast, J.D. Vance has the same chance at winning in Ohio, a much redder state than North Carolina, where Ted Budd also has a 72% chance at holding onto the seat as the retiring incumbent leaves office. So Ohio is going to be a lean Republican state. I think Vance will win it by around 3 to 4%, so a smaller margin for Republicans than in North Carolina, but still it will be a hold, and that will be enough for the GOP to at least win most of the elections in the Midwest, especially in Wisconsin, which is trending better and better for them. And so now we're down to just the last 4 races. These are going to be the closest elections. Democrats 47, Republicans 49. Out of these 4 elections, Democrats need to win 3 to get to 50. Republicans need, of course, 2 to get to 51. And Democrats currently have incumbents in the 3 southern states, while Republicans have Pat Toomey, who is retiring in Pennsylvania. And so we're going to start off with Arizona, where Mark Kelly is running for his first full term after being elected in the 2020 special election. He is up by 3 points in the polls and has led in every single poll ever released for this election. I do think he will end up on top. I think that Mark Kelly is a strong incumbent. He definitely did well in 2020, winning by 2.3% against Martha McSally. I think this year he'll win by a similar margin against Blake Masters. If Republicans had run a more generic GOP candidate in this race, I think they would have a much better chance. In fact, I think Republicans could flip the seat if they ran somebody that was not as terrible as Blake Masters. Blake Masters got the endorsement of Donald Trump, just like Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, just like Herschel Walker in Georgia, as well as Ted Budd in North Carolina and J.D. Vance in Ohio. And just look at where they're at. I mean, we're going to go over Pennsylvania and Georgia later, but in Ohio and North Carolina, Republicans really are not doing that well, especially in the Buckeye state of Ohio. But right now, Arizona is going to be a lean Democratic state. 538 currently gives Kelly a 79% chance at winning. I don't think he will win by over 5%. I think it'll be around, just like I said, the same margin as 2020, 2.3%, I think is a good benchmark. But Mark Kelly definitely is on track to winning his first full term in the Senate. And then in Pennsylvania and Georgia, I really had a hard time at figuring out which race is going to be more solid for Democrats. But at this point, I'm going to say that it's going to be Pennsylvania, where John Fetterman leads over Mehmet Oz by 5.7% in the polls, and he's led in every single poll ever released for this election. John Fetterman is just a good candidate. Mehmet Oz is not. He, of course, only won the nomination with the support of Trump. If Trump did not endorse Mehmet Oz, David McCormick would be the nominee, and he probably would be able to defeat John Fetterman. I don't think Fetterman is going to win by anything near a 6-point margin. I think it'll be closer than even Arizona, but at this point, I think that he's in a very strong position. He has been leading throughout the entirety of the cycle. He was never going to win by a double-digit margin that he was up by in the polls at some point. He was never going to win by 8%, by 7%, even now by 5.7%. Polls are going to overestimate him, and that's just what happens in a state like Pennsylvania. Joe Biden barely won Pennsylvania despite all the polls showing he would probably win by by at least 5 points, but I think that the polling average is strong enough for Fetterman right now, the margin at least, that he will be able to have some wiggle room in terms of underperforming. Pennsylvania currently is expected to go to Democrats, even though it's a flip, as 538 currently gives him a 71% chance at winning, being John Fetterman, and so the state is going to be lean Democratic. I think the margin will be just under 2%, but a big win for Democrats, this being the first flip on this map so far. And now we're left with just 2 more states. 49-49 for both parties, though. Democrats have to win just one, Republicans have to win both, and of course Democrats have incumbents in both of these states. So I'm going to go over Nevada first, where Adam Laxalt, I think, will defeat Catherine Cortez Masto. He's up by 0.7% in the polls, and he really is doing much better than he was before. I mean, just look at the latest polls for this race. He really has been outperforming Masto in many of the recent surveys, and Masto is not that strong of an incumbent, even though she is a Latina, the first Latina ever to be elected to the U.S. Senate. She just isn't doing that well with Latino voters, which you would expect her to be absolutely destroying Laxalt in that demographic. But Laxalt is holding his ground. The failed 2018 gubernatorial candidate, I think, is on track to winning his Senate race, and that would make him a first-term senator representing the state of Nevada. This would be the only flip of the night so far for Republicans, giving them their 50th seat, which they desperately need. I think Republicans should be very, very disappointed if they can't even flip Nevada. Nevada is a very purple state, and a state that's shifting more and more to the right. Democrats have not been trending well in the silver state in recent years, and so if Masto actually wins re-election, that would be a huge blow to the GOP, and Democrats would probably be able to win at least 51 seats if that does occur, and currently 538 has this as a pure toss-up, with both candidates having a 50% chance at winning, but I do think that Laxalt has the advantage. I think there is even a chance he does win by over 1%. Elections are rarely ever decided by margins less than 1 point, but based on just how competitive the election is going to be, I'm going to give it a tilt Republican rating. And so now the balance of power will rest on Georgia for a second time, just like in 2020. I think Democrats, if they win Georgia, they obviously are going to win the majority, but I think that Georgia is going to be the tipping point state, and Democrats are in a good position here, as polls in Georgia are known for being very, very accurate, and even though Warnock is up by 4 points, I do think that he will underperform still. I think that Herschel Walker is going to do a little bit better, but I do think this race is going to go to a runoff, so we might not even know who's going to win the seat in Georgia this November. It will have to wait until December, but Herschel Walker is just running a terrible campaign. He just has way too much baggage about him, and that's one of the main reasons why Warnock is doing so well. If Warnock went against any more of a junior Republican, he probably would lose his re-election, and so right now we're seeing a three-way race with Chase Oliver, a libertarian, also in the running, and he actually appeared on a debate stage alongside Warnock a couple of days ago, as Herschel Walker declined to show up, and so that of course is going to boost the libertarian profile in the Peach State, which I think will be enough to prevent either Warnock or Walker from winning a majority, especially in a state as purple as Georgia. Currently 538 gives Warnock just a 59% chance at winning. It's still going to be very, very close. However, the race was significantly more favorable for the GOP just a couple of months ago, where Herschel Walker had a 62% chance at winning when this forecast was first released, but things really have changed a ton in just the last couple of weeks. Herschel Walker is no longer favored, and of course he is in a pretty terrible position when it comes to polling, and so that's why right now I have Georgia as a blue state. I think that Ralph Lee Warnock will very, very narrowly win his re-election, and probably will do that in a runoff in December of this year. And so this is the 2022 Senate map based on my latest projections. I think right now the race is going to be very, very close for that coveted majority. Democrats right now are on track to flipping Pennsylvania, where Republicans are on track to doing the same in Nevada. The Senate map is going to be very, very close, with both parties having a good chance at winning control. But right now I think that Republicans are stabilizing their leads in Wisconsin, Ohio, and North Carolina. But Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada are definitely within the range of victory for either one party. And so 50-50 is my current projection. I don't think there's going to be too much of a change, and the main reason for this is just because of the terrible nominees that the GOP has put up. If they did not nominate Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, Herschel Walker in Georgia, or Blake Masters in Arizona, I think they could win at least 51 or 52 seats and take a very solid control of the upper chamber. But as of this point in time, the fact that Democrats are doing well in these races is just reflective of the fact that the GOP did make a mistake with their nominees, and there's nothing they can do about it at this point in time. So that'll be it for this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below which party you think will win the Senate majority, and you agree with my projections on this map. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't for the latest news regarding the midterms, and I will see you guys in the next video.